Hello, welcome to the A Book a Day channel. Today, I'm going to talk about a book by the American psychologist Ross Rosenberg, titled The Human Magnet Syndrome. If the title seems puzzling to you, the subtitle will surely make things crystal clear and sound familiar. Why you always attract people who hurt you. It's a common theme in both real life and fictional works like movies and literature, one that deeply resonates with us. A pure, kind-hearted protagonist hopelessly falls in love with a morally corrupt, selfish person, only to be repeatedly deceived, used, and even abandoned. In artistic works to enhance the tragedy and tension, the victim is often portrayed as a woman. These unfortunate victims sometimes bitterly joke about themselves, saying, "I really have a knack for attracting the worst." Some might ask, is there really such a thing as an ability to attract the worst in the world? A simple explanation for this phenomenon is that those who are deceived are naive, lack romantic experience, are new to society, or don't understand the wickedness of human nature. However, in real life, we find that even mature, wise individuals who are successful in their professional fields and have rich emotional histories can still fall into these emotional traps and struggle to escape. Therefore, some psychologists have started to consider whether these common emotional tragedies are due to a certain fixed psychological behavior pattern. The author of this book, Ross Rosenberg, is a psychologist with nearly 35 years of experience in psychotherapy and an expert in psychological trauma and addiction. He runs his own psychotherapy and counseling center in Chicago. Additionally, Rosenberg is a popular figure in psychology education online, with his videos on intimate relationships having accumulated 26 million views globally. Through decades of research and clinical experience, Rosenberg developed the concept of the human magnet syndrome, which is also the title of this book. So, what is the human magnet syndrome? In summary, it is a seemingly normal but actually torturous intimate relationship. The victims, mainly those with low self-esteem and self-worth, continue to obsess over and pursue those who hurt them, even after enduring frustration and pain in their relationships. The abusers share a striking similarity. They are outstanding in some aspects but possess narcissistic personalities, habitually manipulating their partners in relationships. Moreover, this phenomenon frequently occurs because the manipulator and the victim, like the positive and negative poles of a magnet, attract each other from the vast sea of people, thereby constructing this painful but inescapable codependent relationship. For those familiar with our interpretation of the gaslight effect, this concept of a carefully constructed manipulative relationship might ring a bell. However, the gaslight effect does not explain the origin of the victim and manipulator's personality and behavioral patterns, nor does it explain why manipulators have such an unbreakable influence on their victims. Having heard this, you must be quite interested in the content of this book. I will introduce it in two parts. First, let's look at the personality traits and behavioral patterns of the victims and perpetrators in the human magnet syndrome and why they have such an irresistible and fatal attraction to each other. In the second part, we'll follow Rosenberg's narrative to understand why the tragedy of victims and perpetrators can be traced back to their early family environments. In the concluding section, I'll not only summarize the main content and key points of the book, but also briefly introduce Rosenberg's tailored psychological recovery plan for the victims. At the beginning of the book, author Ross Rosenberg candidly reveals that he himself was a severe victim of the human magnet syndrome, having gone through 2 failed marriages as a result. It was in the midst of this exhausting and painful experience that Rosenberg was inspired to diagnose and treat himself through psychological research. The idea for this concept came from a friend who once said to Rosenberg, "I've noticed that every woman you fall in love with is actually the same person, just with a different face." This casual remark struck a chord with Rosenberg, leading him to develop his the human magnet syndrome theory while reevaluating his 2 failed marriages. He concluded that at the beginning of each relationship, he thought his partners were charismatic and ideal, but in reality, they were narcissists with a strong desire for control, disregarding Rosenberg's emotional needs in the marriage. As mentioned earlier, the human magnet syndrome refers to an unbalanced intimate relationship. Rosenberg names the 2 parties involved, the weaker victims, known as codependent symbionts, and the dominant abusers, termed narcissistic manipulators. Codependent symbionts are individuals with low self-esteem and self-worth, often attracted to the dark charisma of narcissistic manipulators. They maintain long-term relationships with these manipulators, believing that leaving would mean losing their self-worth and identity. These symbionts are selflessly devoted in relationships, unconditionally meeting their partner's needs and desires, and possess an almost pathological sense of responsibility and sacrifice. Unfortunately, their efforts and sacrifices are rarely appreciated or reciprocated by their narcissistic partners. Narcissistic manipulators, on the other hand, exhibit traits such as narcissism, selfishness, a sense of entitlement, indifference, and a lack of empathy. In 2002, two renowned psychologists, Paul Hiss and Williams, introduced the concept of the dark triad personality, characterized by Machiavellianism, extreme narcissism, thrill-seeking, and a lack of empathy. This unhealthy personality aligns closely with the narcissistic manipulators Rosenberg describes in the book. In fact, many successful individuals and notorious criminals in reality and in artistic works fit this profile. Why do these codependent symbionts continually admire and depend on so-called scumbags or selfish, narcissistic manipulators? Rosenberg explains that their personalities and emotional needs form an unhealthy, but strong complementary relationship, or as the saying goes, it takes two to tango. In the book, Rosenberg cites the famous couple John Dillinger and his girlfriend Billie Frechette, who partly inspired the main characters Bonnie and Clyde in the well-known Hollywood gangster film Bonnie and Clyde. Dillinger, a notorious bank robber in the 1920s and 1930s in America, committed crimes from a young age, escaped prison twice, and conducted a series of bank robberies in states like Indiana and Wisconsin. Due to his ostentatious and boastful nature, Dillinger brazenly engaged in shootouts with the police and generously gave away stolen money to strangers. During the Great Depression, banks were seen as symbols of greed and evil, and Dillinger's Robin Hood-like actions made him a villain hero in the eyes of many, especially women. Dillinger, acting on his narcissistic manipulator instincts, was a womanizer, including his official girlfriend Billie Frechette. Eventually, Dillinger was ambushed and killed by FBI agents outside a Chicago movie theater, betrayed by one of his mistresses. Billie Frechette, a classic codependent symbiont, came from an unfortunate background and always dated bad boys with criminal records, narcissists, and societal outcasts. Hence, she fell madly in love with the handsome, cunning, and arrogantly defiant Dillinger, leading a perilous and unstable criminal life with him. Rosenberg explains that if codependent symbionts or narcissistic manipulators encounter psychologically healthy, ordinary people, their pathological behaviors would likely trigger immediate discomfort and aversion in these individuals, making the formation of an intimate relationship highly unlikely. However, to a codependent symbiont, the overflowing confidence, striking appearance, eloquent speech, sharp insight, and commanding behavior of a narcissistic manipulator can successfully stimulate their own tendencies towards compliance, sacrifice, and dedication. In other words, only such a powerful, charismatic, and selfish master can fully activate the codependent symbiont's pride in their empathy, dedication, and sacrificial capabilities. The relentless demands of the manipulator are seen by the symbiont as symbols of being loved and valued. At the same time, narcissistic manipulators continually validate their sense of worth and control through their symbionts. Once an intimate relationship forms, both parties begin to play their familiar roles, feeling comfortable and at ease. This sense of comfort and ease largely constitutes the magnetic force that makes it difficult for codependent symbionts and narcissistic manipulators to separate. Rosenberg even likens this relationship to drug addiction. Initially, both parties experience great pleasure, but as time passes, they develop an emotional tolerance, requiring more and more stimulation to maintain the same level of excitement. This explains why in such unhealthy relationships, both parties uncontrollably pursue heart-wrenching drama and sweet moments. Many idle dramas and online novels are filled with similar plots, where the protagonists frequently argue and conflict due to misunderstandings, leading to extreme actions including self-harm and breakups. Then, usually the male character, in a sudden realization of regret, lavishes excessive affection and reconciliation on their partner, driving the plot into the next similar cycle. As the relationship deepens, especially for the codependent symbiont, thoughts of detoxing or breaking up may arise due to the partner's selfishness, betrayal, and manipulation. But like a drug addiction, breaking free from such an unhealthy relationship also results in severe withdrawal symptoms. The fear of losing an emotional anchor and leaving the comfort zone upon separation leads to immense loneliness and panic. Ultimately, most, whether dependent or manipulative, involuntarily choose to endure the relationship. Rosenberg illustrates this with a real-life case. He once treated a patient named Teresa, a severe codependent symbiont. After 9 months of therapy, she finally divorced her abusive, narcissistic husband. However, 6 months later, Teresa announced she wanted to pause her therapy, believing she had recovered and was ready to start a new relationship. Despite Rosenberg's strong doubts, he could not persuade her otherwise. Just 8 months later, Teresa returned to Rosenberg for help, appearing as sad and despondent as when she first started therapy. She confessed that she couldn't resist returning to a dating site in search of a reliable long-term partner. First, she met Jonathan, a good-looking, positive man with a stable job. Teresa instantly thought Jonathan was her savior, her true love. However, their first date turned out to be their last. Teresa felt that Jonathan, despite his qualities, couldn't evoke the stormy passion she anticipated. After 2 hours of conversation, a tired and despondent Teresa left, using an excuse. Frustrated, Teresa decided to change her approach and continued searching for men who could electrify her, leading her to Chet. Chet was the stereotypical bad boy and ladies' man, handsome and well-built, often posing shirtless in his profile photos. Teresa was irresistibly drawn to this charisma, disregarding Chet's profile status as unemployed, looking for work. After their first dinner date, they quickly fell in love. Teresa described their attraction as magnetic, inescapable even if I wanted to. However, Chet soon revealed his true colors. Like Teresa's ex-husband, he was narcissistic, temperamental, and an alcoholic. Teresa ended the relationship in shame and pain, seeking Rosenberg's help once more. Rosenberg remarks that many celebrated love stories and fairy tale couples admired by people, especially the youth, in reality and in classic literature, are essentially interactions between codependent symbionts and narcissistic manipulators. The former, often portrayed as beautiful, innocent, and submissive women, devote themselves selflessly to the latter, who are typically handsome, cold, selfish, and of high social status. Examples include former U.S. President Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline, or Christian and Anastasia from 50 Shades of Grey. In such literary works, the narrative often ends with the codependent symbiont transforming the manipulator through continuous dedication and compliance, a scenario rarely seen in reality and more of a wishful fantasy of the dependent party. People might wonder why a normal person becomes a submissive codependent symbiont or a dark, selfish narcissistic manipulator. Author Ross Rosenberg attributes the root cause of both to a critical developmental phase in infancy and early childhood, where they unfortunately experience an abnormal environment lacking in love and attention. In a previous episode, I discussed a psychological book titled I Wish My Parents Had Read This Book, which proposed that psychological trauma and incorrect behavior patterns caused by parents' neglect or mistakes during our upbringing are unconsciously inflicted upon our own children, perpetuating harm and dysfunction across generations. Many people develop the same personality traits and behaviors as their parents because these are passed down through familial ties. Parents' characteristics and behaviors are consciously or unconsciously inherited and mimicked by their children, acting like a psychological and emotional legacy. This legacy includes not only positive emotions and traits, but also psychological flaws and hidden traumas. In his book, Rosenberg also presents a similar concept, referring to these intergenerationally transmitted behavior patterns and character traits as emotional batons. He explains that many individuals, including himself, suffer from the human magnet syndrome because their parents' relationship modeled this unhealthy dynamic of manipulation and being manipulated. Rosenberg recalls studying his own family's emotional history and discovering that the seeds of danger were already sown. His father, Earl, had a strong narcissistic personality and was a typical narcissistic manipulator. Earl's parents had a troubled marriage, and after Rosenberg's grandfather abandoned the family, his grandmother and great-grandmother vented all their resentment and anger on Earl. To escape this cold home environment, Earl joined the military at a young age and served in World War II, spending 4 years in Germany as part of the occupying forces. During this period of freedom, Earl became irresponsible and pursued women recklessly, showing no interest in settling down. This behavior continued even after he returned from the war. Rosenberg recalls how his father, handsome and charming, met his mother, the then 16-year-old Muriel, at a dance. Innocent and beautiful Muriel quickly became Earl's prey and fell for his charms. In fact, Muriel was a typical codependent symbiont, raised in an unhealthy family environment herself. Her mother, Rosenberg's grandmother, was a cold, self-centered control freak who showed little concern for her children, leading Muriel to develop a pleasing personality, accustomed to self-denial and neglecting her own needs in an effort to appease her parents. When Earl passionately pursued her, Muriel felt an unprecedented sense of value and believed he was her soulmate sent to rescue her from misery. They quickly married within 6 months. However, once the initial romance and passion faded, the internal crises of their marriage rapidly surfaced. Earl, as a husband, constantly exploited and manipulated Muriel, belittling her through insults and lying to their children about her incompetence. Meanwhile, he sought affairs. As a father, Earl's attention and care for his children were extremely limited, and he sowed discord among them. He cleverly made Rosenberg believe his siblings were taking away the fatherly love he deserved. This caused Rosenberg anxiety, feeling shame whenever his father ignored him. In his book, Rosenberg painfully writes that his father completely controlled him. As a child, he had no self-esteem or sense of security, no friends at school, and his sole aim was to become Dad's favorite child, essentially fueling his father's narcissistic tank. Disillusioned with life, Rosenberg turned to drugs at 14 and eventually sought treatment in a medical institution, a valuable opportunity that halted his downward spiral. Rosenberg's grandparents and parents epitomize the human magnet syndrome, with his grandfather and father being narcissistic manipulators and his grandmother and mother being codependent symbionts. This unhealthy intimate relationship pattern became the emotional baton passed down in the Rosenberg family, eventually reaching Ross Rosenberg himself. Specifically, how are character traits and behavior patterns transmitted across generations? In Born to be Different by British psychologist Oliver James, it's mentioned that in an unloving environment, infants and young children, for their own survival, often rationalize neglect and mistreatment from their parents. They also mimic their parents' language and behavior to achieve identity recognition, as imitation and identification are direct ways to express love. For example, a girl who suffered from her father's violence in childhood might fall in love with a similarly violent and domineering man as an adult. Rosenberg's own traits as a codependent symbiont stem from his mother. In his book, Rosenberg analyzes how codependent symbionts and narcissistic manipulators grow and inherit their traits in unhealthy family atmospheres. Let's first look at codependent symbionts. In the book The Gaslight Effect, which was discussed in our audiobook reviews, author Dr. Stern suggests that the process of control becoming established and deepened is also a process of the gradual dissolution of the controlled person's self-awareness. The development of a child's self-awareness is most critical between the ages of 0 and 4. Rosenberg states that if children receive sufficient and appropriate care and attention from their parents, trust in others, autonomy, and proactivity become the foundational aspects of their personality. Conversely, a lack of such nurturing leads to passivity, negativity, shyness, and self-doubt. Essentially, if children know their feelings elicit stable attention and responses from their parents, they naturally feel loved and secure, taking the first step in developing a healthy personality. Unfortunately, due to a lack of awareness or inherent narcissistic tendencies, many parents fail to provide this during this crucial stage, akin to cutting corners or intentionally damaging the foundation during the construction of a building. This results in a structure that is never properly completed or lacks stability. Vulnerable and highly dependent children thus develop a skill to actively cooperate with their parents' gaslighting manipulation, satisfying their parents' fantasies to gain as much attention and care as possible. Both narcissistic and codependent parents can inflict lasting trauma on their children. Narcissistic parents, engulfed in the illusion of being an omnipotent God, often interpret their child's discontent and sorrow as "I'm doing what's best for them. They just don't understand it yet." Codependent parents, on the other hand, emotionally blackmail their children continuously and unendingly. They may unrealistically demand excellence in all areas so they can bask in the admiration of others, or pathologically depend on their children, refusing to let them live independently even into adulthood. They justify this under the guise of gratitude and repayment for upbringing, but deep down, they fear that their child's departure signifies a loss of emotional support and their own value. In these circumstances, many children unwittingly become codependent symbionts, while their parents often pride themselves on their children's apparent success. In childhood and adolescence, codependent symbionts often seem like model children. They are precociously understanding, adept at reading subtle cues, and quickly respond to their parents' slightest mood changes, concealing their true feelings and striving to meet their parents' demands with a pleasing smile. Moreover, due to frequent, baseless scolding, they develop a habit of apologizing and expressing regret from a young age. This habit can lead to either a personality of excessive self-blame and low self-esteem, or a tendency to lie habitually, as apologizing against one's wishes and fabricating lies to avoid punishment and danger seem quite similar. Rosenberg concludes that codependent symbionts and narcissistic manipulators view each other as soulmates because they find a deep, pathological familiarity in these relationships. This familiarity compels them to repeat the entrenched relationship patterns of their childhood, needing to be loved by someone incapable of loving them or anyone else. Essentially, these unhealthy intimate relationships are a reenactment of their childhood relationships with their dysfunctional, narcissistic parents. Now, let's consider how narcissistic manipulators are formed. In a sense, narcissistic manipulators, as opposed to codependent symbionts, were often seen as bad children in their childhood, mischievous, troublesome, and disobedient. This is because narcissistic parents perceive such children as the antithesis of the perfect child depicted in their imagination or advertisements. There are many reasons for criticism. The child might not be attractive, doesn't resemble them, cries too much, is too clingy, always causing trouble, refuses to sleep, and so on. Worse, these perceived shortcomings shatter the parents' delusional self-esteem and narcissism, leading them to unconsciously project their own shame and frustration onto the child. The child becomes a scapegoat for the parents' misbehavior and incompetence. This vicious cycle begins with constant insults and abuse fueling the child's anger and self-awareness, leading to both passive and active defiance against the parents, followed by even harsher punishment. To alleviate the pain of such abuse, these children develop a unique method of escape: dissociation. In simple terms, if a child cannot escape a terrible reality, they disconnect from the current situation to avoid negative emotions associated with a traumatic environment, such as remaining eerily calm during abuse, as if they are observing someone else being mistreated. What are the adverse effects of dissociation? Firstly, it forces the child to suppress all unpleasant memories into their subconscious, forming latent trauma. Secondly, dissociation leads children not only to ignore their own emotional needs and feelings but also to become indifferent to the emotional needs of others, hindering the development of healthy empathy, a crucial element in social interaction and forming intimate relationships. Furthermore, due to their lack of empathy, these children cannot establish equal, reciprocal, and honest relationships with others. Instead, they begin to mimic their controlling, superior parents, believing that selfish and capricious interactions are the only way to feel good and justified. To compensate for the humiliation of being constantly belittled and oppressed by their parents, these children create a delusion in their minds they are vitally important to the world, and their current suffering is a necessary ordeal or proof of their significance. This fantasy, while helping them survive a scarred childhood, deeply embeds narcissistic traits into their personality. Therefore, Rosenberg concludes that both codependent symbionts and narcissistic manipulators view each other as soulmates on a conscious level. However, this is because they recognize a pathological familiarity in each other. This subconscious familiarity forces them to repeat the deep-seated relationship patterns of their childhood, a longing to be loved by someone incapable of loving them or anyone else. Thus, the intimate relationships of codependent symbionts and narcissistic manipulators are, in fact, a repetition of their childhood relationships with their dysfunctional narcissistic parents. To summarize, the human magnet syndrome by Ross Rosenberg delves into a common phenomenon in intimate relationships, addressing why many marriages or romantic relationships resemble a mutually torturous dance. It explores why kind, humble, and considerate individuals often attract and become obsessively fascinated with narcissistic, arrogant, and domineering partners. This pattern stems from unhealthy personality traits: the codependent symbiont, who depends on continuous sacrifice to feel self-worth, and the narcissistic manipulator, who is self-centered and dominating. When they meet, their pathological compatibility quickly leads to a magnetic, codependent relationship. Rosenberg points out that both codependent symbionts and narcissistic manipulators' pathological personalities originate from a lack of love and attention in their family environments during childhood, preventing the development of a healthy, positive, and self-loving character. Instead, they mimic their parents' behaviors, inheriting these patterns like an emotional legacy, termed by Rosenberg as the emotional baton. He uses his own family history as an example, revealing how these inherited traumas turned him into a severe codependent symbiont. For those caught in the human magnet syndrome, Rosenberg teases the content of his next book, which will focus on breaking free from these unhealthy relationships and reshaping one's understanding of intimate relationships and self-worth to cultivate healthier, equal partnerships. However, he briefly mentions his self-love recovery program at the end of this book, outlining its 10 steps to help codependent symbionts break free from manipulation. The first stage involves hitting rock bottom, marking the beginning of recovery as one seeks help from friends or professional counselors. The second stage is understanding the human magnet syndrome and recognizing one's traits as a codependent symbiont. The third stage is akin to detox, necessitating solitude and resisting the urge to return to the manipulator or find a substitute. Successful navigation through solitude leads to the fourth stage, where patients learn about the mindset and manipulation tactics of narcissistic manipulators. In the fifth and sixth stages, patients deepen their psychological recovery by learning to set boundaries and stand firm against manipulation. Subsequent stages involve confronting and healing hidden traumas, abandoning old psychological response patterns, and learning self-love. Eventually, patients can independently establish new, equal, and healthy intimate relationships. Additionally, Rosenberg includes a psychological model self-assessment chart in the 5th chapter, helping readers identify their personality type within intimate relationships and understand compatible partner types for a healthy relationship dynamic. This summary encapsulates the essence of the human magnet syndrome. If you find this overview helpful, consider liking, subscribing, and sharing the video. Congratulations on completing another book.